This evening for Field Guide to Hardscapes. My name's Emerson Rain. I'm the Continuing Education Manager at Longwood Gardens. Delighted that you are joining us for this course. I am just popping on at the beginning here to welcome all of you and to mention a few things before we officially get started. Just a reminder, so throughout the duration of this course, we will be using an online classroom, which will have content, and that's where you'll submit assignments, and there we might post announcements throughout the course. So you should have received an email invitation to join that course. And if you have never used our online classroom before, you would have been invited to make an account, like make a password. So just be sure to look out for that email. And I highly recommend you spend a little bit of time getting to know the space. It's using a platform called D2L or Brightspace. A lot of you may already be familiar with it. It's the same platform that we use for all of our online courses. If you have never used our online classroom before, I highly recommend you spend a little time in the Getting Started module. That will just give you some information about how to use the online classroom, and it will have some important documents that will be useful throughout the course, including syllabus, and a little bit of information on your instructor. So with that, I'm going to introduce Greg. So we have Greg Schomburg joining us to teach this course, Field Guide to Hardscapes. Greg is a creative designer with over 25 years of experience in landscape design, and his professional background includes an emphasis on heavy timber structures, carpentry, architectural design, and hardscape design. So a very apt course for him to be teaching for us. He currently resides in State College, where he owns and operates Marengo Pass Design, which is a design consulting business with the goal of helping others define and improve their home environments. So thank you so much for joining us, Greg.
Thank you. Happy to jump in if that works for everybody now. I just wanted to say welcome, and we're going to jump right in today. Actually, that's going to be sort of the pace of as we work through things. I'll start to share my screen, and we'll jump right into it, and then we'll cover as we go. So just wanted to welcome everybody and say hello, and I'll jump into sharing a screen right now. All right, so hopefully everybody should have that screen up. Wanted to just jump right in with a little bit of an introductory part. Thank you, Emerson, for the introduction, and we appreciate the chance just to have a connection to it. And I like to jump right in with something a little bit different for it. And as we go into the session, one of the things that I start to look at for this class is backstory, and especially with hardscape material. Everything that we have, everybody loves an origin story, right? A lot of the movies that have come out in the last 5 to 10 years have talked about what it is beforehand, and everybody knows the story of Batman, right? So before Batman put on the mask and he started fighting crime and he started doing all that stuff, he was Bruce Wayne, right? He was just a little kid. He was out on the streets. His parents were, tragically taken from him. And then, we see him growing through this other part. But everybody loves that origin story. And as we look at hardscape material, one of the things that I always will look at for this class is the backstory of materials. And so, for instance, let's take one of, instead of Batman being the superhero, let's look at bluestone for one of the materials that we look at. And if we were to do a deep dive into bluestone, and we were to look at its backstory and find out where it, how it got here and why it looks the way it does, we would look at a couple different things for it. And so, for instance, we'll kind of run through this part of it and say, bluestone itself is a sedimentary stone. And what is, a little bit of a science, we'll talk about why the face of bluestone is why it is. And so if you were to look at an area like this, I'm actually going to turn on my laser pointer. Here we go. So if we were to look at an area like this in a quarry setting, and then you'd look at some of the material that's down below here, we would look at it and say, why is the face of bluestone look the way that it does? And so if you know anything about sedimentary stone, right, over time, there's layers of sediment deposited in a wet area. It's compressed over time. And then later on, if you look at these other areas, that becomes a stone material. And then if it's taken up and split, those same sedimentary deposits that are squished down into this way are then exposed as we look into it. So a little bit of the idea of why it looks the way it does. Secondly, I would look at it and say bluestone is a quarried material. We'll talk about it being a natural product in a second, but it's a quarried material. And so it's extracted in various forms. And when we talk about natural materials, natural materials being pulled out of the earth and brought out in these big block forms. It can be extracted in various forms, but then it can be processed a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So it comes out in a rough form and then it takes some other shapes. So it's a very versatile material because its secondary processing shapes it into other forms that it wouldn't find right out of the ground. Third, you'd look at it and say, oh, bluestone's a natural product. What does that mean, right? It's a natural product, meaning it's harvested from the earth and it's brought out from a quarry environment. And so a little bit of the local geology is going to determine the color range. And when you look at a natural product, especially if you've ever worked with something like on the inside of a house and you've looked at hardwood and you've stained hardwood material, you know that hardwood being on the natural side and the inside is a little bit different than a manufactured product that's going to be engineered like an LVT or a snap click flooring. The variety and the range of materials is going to be a little bit nuanced because it's a natural product and you can't always exactly anticipate what it's going to do when you bring it out of the ground and expose it to the elements. And the last three are, those are sort of the natural part that come up to it. The last three are a little bit more human factors. We always have economics of it. Obviously, when you take something out of the ground, like in this top photograph, it's a block, right? And if you just said, here's a block, right? What do you do with it? And you're like, I don't know. But if you take the material and you shape it a little bit more, the more you shape it and the more you do secondary processing, the higher the cost of the material is going to be too. So as we follow along with it, you'll find that it's the more you do to it, the higher the cost becomes of the material. Second, or the last two parts, just to talk about it from a backstory standpoint, are from a practicality part. If you look at towns like Hoboken, New Jersey, or even there's a little place that's a neighborhood in State College called Bellefonte. There are places both in Hoboken and Bellefonte where 100-year-old plus sidewalks are still paved in bluestone because it's such a durable and it's such a reliable paving surface. As long as you don't drive a dump truck over it or do something goofy, if it's used in the material way that's intended to use, it's a very practical material, so it'll expand the test of time very well. And then lastly, ingenuity. We touched a little bit on secondary processing, but when you look at the secondary processing, you can pretty much take it to any use. So when we look at bluestone, and that's just for an example, we'll look at the same thing for engineered materials and we'll look at other materials as we go through it, but it's always going to be important because the backstory of the material is always going to affect what it looks like today in our use. The other thing that I'm always going to look at for it is it nature versus nurture, right? I have, I have two different kids and my kids raised in the same household. I have a son and a daughter and they have very different personalities. When I raised both of them and they're only 2 years apart, if I would give each one a cupcake and around their time of their birthdays, because they were about 2 weeks apart, one would look like she was wearing it, right? She had cupcake in her hair, she had frosting all over her. And my son, on the other hand, he would look at it and, his cupcake would be like, did you even have one? Like, what did you do with it? He was so precise with it, right? So same thing for hardscape material. There are materials and there are behavior elements in a material that are going to be inherent to it. And there are going to be things in secondary processing that are going to be learned materials. And so, for example, if we're going to continue with the bluestone part, the inherent properties of bluestone we talked about before, the sedimentary part, right? And that's going to affect its face and the way it looks here. The fact that it's a sandstone means it's pretty uniform. And then there's a nuanced color range. Those are the things that it has just because that's the way it was shaped. That's the way it came out of the ground. Well, on the other hand, bluestone's nurture happens to be the secondary processing. And I know that normally in nature, you don't find rabbit-shaped pieces of bluestone in the ground. I have a niece and a nephew who a couple of years ago lost a bunny. That was their little pet bunny. And I was charged with making a bluestone headstone in the shape of a rabbit for their little grave marker. And I recognized that, I had a piece of bluestone, I had an angle grinder and some chisels. And it was actually pretty easy to do because bluestone is such a well-behaved material that I could create this outline, cut it out with the angle grinder and start to shape it a little bit. Meaning that bluestone's nurture in secondary processing, there are a couple things with it. It spans flat areas well, so it means it's nice for paving and coping. It shapes well, so you can do things with it in terms of different formats. And then it's relatively consistent and soft, at least for a rock. It's somewhat soft. You can do things like shaping it in the field. And so when you take material out and you bring it out from the quarry, there's some things you can do to it when you're putting it out in the site. So again, this is just a sort of as a for instance. And one of the other principles that we're going to touch back as we look on each of the materials that we cover in this course, there's a guiding principle in that the material itself is the performance of the material is rooted in its origin. So if you're to bring a block of stone out of the ground, it's really going to depend on the geology and what you do to that stone. But if you have a research and development team that's looked at it, for instance, we're going to talk about a company called TechoBlock in a couple, I guess, in a couple weeks. And TechoBlock's one of these companies that only makes manufactured products. And so their R&D team has done really wonderful things with trying to say, hey, we're going to engineer all these things so that it can perform in a certain task. And so whether it's a natural material or whether it's an engineered product, the material origin is going to yield some of its inherent performance abilities. And then the secondary manufacturing, what you do to that material, is going to yield its engineering performance. And so when it comes down to it, what we're going to do is look at it and say every material has either an appropriateness or an inappropriateness for a certain need or a certain rating. And we'll talk about that in an example. I want to touch base on one just sort of housekeeping and pacing thing as we go. This class will be about a 90 minutes with a short break halfway. I'm sensitive to the fact that right now it's at the end of the day and everybody has led a full day and they've come here and they've sat in front of their screens. And so at about the 45 or so 50-minute mark, let's give everybody a chance to get up, stretch their legs, do whatever they need to do, and then we'll jump back into it. One other thing I was going to note just from a housekeeping standpoint is I was in an online class a couple of, I guess it was probably close to a year and a half or so ago. Quite honestly, it was one of the worst classes I've ever taken in my life. But the gem that I took away from it was the instructor was always really nice to say that they would be the first person in and the last person out. And recognizing that we are going over sort of a lecture format and you're hearing me yap, 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 what I was hoping to do is sort of spend some time at the end. I will always be the last person out of it. So if you have questions for anything, I absolutely want to take care of any questions that are there. We can use the bright space part if somebody wants to just dial in a question that's there. But I'll always stay on the class for about 5 to 10 minutes afterwards, so that if somebody's like, oh, what about this part of it? I'll stay on afterwards. And that way, whoever wants to go off for their day, because again, it'll be 8 o'clock by the time we wrap up, go off by your day and do your things. And then if anybody wants to finish up or have some questions, feel free to tailor on at the end and I'll hang for those too. So I just wanted to cover a little bit of housekeeping thing there. A little bit of a roadmap of the course as we go through here. I'll get to this tall gentleman right here. His name is Mark, and I'll touch base on him in a moment. But I wanted to just give you an idea of where we're going over the next 4 weeks. It's 4 sessions, as you know. But session 1 will be a course intro, and we're going to just look at natural paving materials and the paving materials that come out of the ground, and then mostly are focused on what they are to begin with, and then how you secondary process them to use them in a hardscape setting. Session 2, this is not a design class, but we do touch on a little bit of design. A lot of times when someone's looking at it and they're like, well, okay, great information. What do I do with this, right? Well, we're going to do a little bit of an intro to the design challenge that we'll focus in on the 4th session. And then we'll take a second part and we'll say paving materials part 2. But the part 2 of the paving materials will be all the manufactured products that we didn't talk about today. So those will be the things that are engineered. Those will be the things that have been engineered to create a use and fabricated in a factory at that point. Session 3, you'll start to see some of the materials that popped up in 1 and 2 come back in session 3 as taller or larger materials. And that'll be when we talk about retaining wall materials. And then we're also going to talk about garden structures, which is kind of a favorite of mine. I love doing the structure piece of it and thinking about some of the things that are 3-dimensionality and how they fit into it. And then session 4, we'll talk about a construction overview, and we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about design considerations. And then we'll revisit and look at that design challenge that we did, so we have a chance to kind of dig in and look at some of the similarities and the other things that are there. But we'll talk about that later. The reason I wanted to bring up this fellow along the side is if you look at this, about the point where his head meets the skyline, that would be about 6 feet 7 inches. He is a tall drink of water. And that piece of bluestone that is behind him is, now granted, it's up on a pallet and it's about 4 inches above, but this stands about 7 feet tall. Mark was very, very instrumental. He works at a company called Bricks and Stone in Boalsburg, and then near the State College area. And the point that I wanted to make is never underestimate and forget the benefit of your local material supply company. The people that sell these things, you can oftentimes find a person there as you're taking this information and studying on your own or looking for things or trying to find out, like, comparison of it. never underestimate the benefit of these local material supply yards. They are excellent, and generally you can find a really good, knowledgeable person. So it's just a point that I'll kind of bring back up as we go into, but I did want to note it now before I forget as we go into it. The field guide format. If you're familiar with the Roger Torrey Peterson guides, right? I love these. I've loved these since I was about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years old. I've actually seen these for a long time. This edition was handed down to me for a while. I think these might have been the ones I got in college, but they have trees and shrubs, they have eastern birds, we have mammals, we have wild tracks. The field guide format is really nice because it's systematic, right? I don't really like to jump into things and just say like I'm going to guess what they are. So this class is intended to give you some systematic approach to the hardscape material that you find out there. So as we go through things, we're going to start with a name and a category and a manufacturing origin. If you're familiar with plant material, it would be like looking at the genus part of the genus and species before we talk about the hybridization or we talk about the subsets of it. So we'll always look at a name and a category and a manufacturing origin to keep everything kind of grouped together. Then after that, we'll look at material characteristics and identifying features. You'll be able to compare these and rank them to different things as you go through. We'll look at things like industry standards and compare and contrast and make sure that you understand the things about, like, if you're to order a pallet of something and it's stacked material, what are the unit sizes you might get? If you're ordering loose material, what might be the tonnage, and how do you look at those things from an industry standard point so that you have an understanding of where the material comes from and how it would be delivered to a job site or to a residence if you're working through things. One note about the terms and features, I recognized about a week ago, it's like there's a lot of information in the terms and features. And so I made sure that there were handouts. Those will be in the bright space section, but so that no one has to scramble and write down 55 things as you go through them, I've kept that in sort of a field guide component, where you look at these and it starts to talk about alternate and pennant leaves and all the different factors that are in a field guide. I made sure that we kind of followed along with those things so that the terms and features are spelled out for you. That way you can jump into it and just have them as you go. And then the last two would be material insights. I want to make sure that it's basically would be to complete the sentence. When you're working with this material, ... right? This is what you would get if you were working with this material. And it's a little bit along the lines of, it's been a little while since our kids were little, but I remember someone handed us a copy of What to Expect When You're Expecting. And it's a little bit of like, here's what to expect if you have a sandstone or an aggregate or something else. Like, here's some of the nuances and behavioral patterns you might see with the material. And then always, in addition, I always want to make sure that there are additional resources for further self-study. I recognize a class like this as a jumping off point. We have 4 sessions to be able to look at something. And there might be a moment at which my dad was always really good at this for the times when I remember being a younger kid. He was an editor and he would take something that was his main focus. And every couple of years, he would study something that was a little bit related to it. So like his main Venn diagram was here, and he would study something a little bit over here and then draw those things back to his core. And then, another couple of years later, he would draw something back to his core. I recognize in a class like this, there might be something you're like, oh, I love that. I want to find out more about it. And I always want to make sure we have additional resources for you to be able to do that as well. So, and then I'm not crazy about text intensive slides, but there's a couple of them in the preamble part here, and then we'll get to some more imagery and some other things to it. But I did want to note that as we talk about this first part of paving materials, kind of what the class is from an expectation standpoint. I practiced for about 20 years on the nose in the Midwest and Chicago, North Shore residential area. Spent a lot of time building some fun things with a lot of wonderful people that were just incredibly talented people. I sort of felt like it was an honor to work with a bunch of folks that were there. Well, this course is really not going to be an exhaustive look, but what we want to do is sort of look at some common East Coast variants and things that you'd find, so that as you do look through and as you walk through a garden and you see the different options and different materials that are available, you can start to recognize what they are, how to use them, where to find them, where to source them, some of the pitfalls that you might avoid if you're anticipating those. And so it's not an exhaustive look, but it's a good framework for that personal study and further study. And then really one of the things that I'll look at is, as we review, where would this material be appropriately used? And so I want to give you 3 examples in this part, and then we'll jump onto this long list on the right. But essentially, if you were to look at something and say, All right, my scenario is I have a sloped driveway and it's exposed to heavy annual rainfall. It's a really wet site and everything drains through it. I would probably look at it and say, if you were looking through the option of 5 different materials and you thought, oh, loose aggregate might be nice, you're like, well, it might be the most inappropriate material because on that loose slope, we actually happen to have a very steep driveway on our property. Thankfully, it is not gravel and we can get up it. But as you know, that small aggregate would most likely wash to the bottom every time there was a heavy rainfall. And you'd also spin your tires consistently trying to get up that driveway as well. So looking at something like that, you might say loose gravel probably falls on the inappropriate side of things for it, whereas a different type of an aggregate or an asphalt with maybe a heavy aggregate in it, which is what our driveway is, thankfully, that might be a more appropriate choice. So a second example might be a swimming pool deck, like a swimming pool patio area for younger users. So whether it's kids or grandkids, as we're looking at that, it might say, well, irregular bluestone might be a beautiful material, and I'll kind of come back to that, and we love that material, but it can be a little bit sharp. Maybe you don't want to use it as the coping because the edge might be a little bit sharp. So, little ones, as they're putting their feet over the edge, it's a good chance for them maybe get scraped up. If we could avoid that, maybe that's not the perfect material. It might be nice for another area aside, but that might be inappropriate as a choice. On the third part, if we were to look at it and say, we've got a level area, we just need a patio installed, like we just need a patio part. On that part, there might be multiple appropriate options. And at that point, we would probably look at it and say, what do we go to this right side column? And we'd look at things and we'd start, like it or not, economics always plays a big factor into what we decide we're going to end up with as a final choice. Might be beautiful, but if we can't afford it when it's not really outside of our budget list, or if we're trying to make sure that budget stretches. I once had somebody tell me years and years ago, he said, literally whatever you can dream up, I can afford. And I was like, oh, I like to spend your money. That's fine. But that's not always the case for us. When we build a project, when we build things, I'm a little bit more sensitive to the budget that we have for it. So that might be one of the things that you factor in early on. The other thing I would look at is say, who is going to be installing this project? Is it a person that has 40 years of experience and is a very skilled mason? And if that's the case, we might say, oh, maybe there's a broader scope of material that we might use. Or is it somebody that's a little bit green behind the ears and maybe doesn't have as much experience? And so we might look at the material and say, I don't really want to give somebody this design to build and install if I can't find somebody to build it that way. We'll look at things like home style and certainly the design intention. Generally when you look at a home style, unless the design intention is to completely break from the style of the house, you're probably going to find something that wants to be a little bit complementary, but you'd also take that design intention into consideration as well. And then we look like things that like anticipated use. There's always a metric that I use of frequency, intensity, and duration. And I look at it and say, is it used very frequently? How intensively is it used? And how often is it going to be used from that part? So I always go back to frequency, intensity, and duration. And I look at that from a standpoint of, will that material hold up to the traffic that I expect it to be underutilization for? Age and mobility, aging in place is always a really big one I've had the good fortune to be able to work on projects where it includes the home architecture as well and the design of the home. And so many people now are thinking about aging in place and spending time in, staying there for a long period of time. Most of the decisions that I make indoor and outdoor now at least have thought about that and thought about what's the right way to anticipate. I don't want to make a giant maintenance hazard or a giant maintenance nightmare if we can avoid it. And then certainly things like site access, can you get to the site? Would it have to all be carried in? Things like snow removal, which sounds super mundane, but when it doesn't work and you can't actually remove snow from it, you sit there and go, oh my goodness, what do we do? I remember years and years ago, someone designed a courtyard that was hedged in, but it was a driveway courtyard. And the person that installed it ended up having to talk to the owner, and they were like, we actually have to shovel all the snow out of your courtyard because we didn't think about how to remove snow from your courtyard when we were there. So things like that are pitfalls that you want to avoid. A lot of things come down to the health, safety, and welfare of the users and the occupants that are there that are going to come into it. And certainly things like the context, it's, think about the context. So anyway, we start with this list and we start up here with like something mundane as budget. And then we go down this list and we end up establishing a list of priorities as we go through them. So we start with, just factoring these things down, filtering them, and going through list after list of things until we find what the right material is for a site and for an object. So for us, for natural stone paving, we're going to look at bluestone today. We're going to look at limestone, sandstone, granite, and travertine. And we're going to go from the least fussy thing that just matches with everything, right? There's always like that idea of like that favorite pair of jeans or khakis. That's bluestone, just spoiler alert. And then there's that fussy thing where it's like, oh my goodness, someone invited travertine. It's an awesome material, but it really can be a challenge to work with. And I always, my kids have always been very like, they've always picked on me for giving things personification. Travertine's one of those ones where you're like, oh my goodness, like seriously, we have to do this. So as we look at that, some of the similarities that we look at among all natural stone paving products are going to carry through. And I figured it's just easier to focus on those at once. When you look at natural materials, right, by definition, they're a natural material. They're quarried, and so they come out in a rough form. And then there's post-quarry manufacturing that shapes that to some other function or some other feature. So it's always going to go from a rough format. This actually is a quarry that was in Wisconsin and is in Wisconsin. They always did a wonderful job. If you look really closer, you were zooming here. It's actually people in the back of the dump truck. They used to host an open house every day until they found out that their insurance rider got so high. They used to host it was an open house so that they could place and bump the budget for their local school district. And it was a cool thing. Everybody came and did it. And then they realized that like it became crazy for their insurance. So they had to shut that piece of it down. But people used to ride in the dump trucks. They'd go out and see the quarries, all the other parts of it. But in and amongst that quarry and all the people that are there for scale, all of this material would then be processed into some other format. The other thing that'll factor in for natural stone paving is there's always going to be not for everything, but for most things, there's going to be a domestic and there's going to be an international point of origin. And so I'll just throw a little bit of a human side in there. Sometimes the things that come in from overseas and you're like, oh, how can that possibly be so expensive? And I won't go too far down this road, but there is sometimes a human toll that's taken on materials that are, taken out of the ground in other parts. So it's just something to sort of be considerate of and think about. Sometimes the material that comes from overseas is not always, like, for instance, if you look at New York granite versus a granite that's been imported, sometimes the price is very similar despite shipping it from across the other side of the ocean. And there's a reason for that. And we won't go too deep into it, but there's something sometimes to think about with lead times, availability, and where that point of origin, where it's sourced from to come into. Also, when we look at natural materials, there's an ordering and a shipping part. Generally it's sold in pallets or by the ton, and sometimes you need a conversion rate to figure out what the tonnage is for coverage, so you have enough material that's there. And again, we'll get to more slides and more photos in a moment, but a few more things. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. And then so from this part, mixed sizes are pretty common. Sometimes the material is what I would call imprecise. You'll get it and you'll think that it would be a square, right? But sometimes the square actually is two-sided square. And so it looks like it might be, but when you actually go to install it, so there's a little bit of an imprecise nature of natural materials that can drive some people crazy if they don't know how to use them, but also can be something that's worked around with if it's in the right hands. And then generally speaking, I would say this, there was a person that told me years ago that he was a very excellent mason. And it was like, well, he was a younger installer, hadn't really spent a lot of time doing things. He was very good with the precast materials and the manufactured products, and he could glue pieces together. Like that was what he knew how to do. And so he could set a base part. He wasn't necessarily the most experienced mason compared to somebody that had 40 years of doing like lots of crazy things, but he was able to build to a degree. Generally speaking, with natural materials, the skill level required to put them in goes up a little bit when you're working with a natural stone product with it too. So a couple terms as we get into natural stone paving that apply to everything. And it would be, in natural stone paving, one of the things that you're always going to be looking at is the thickness of the material, especially in paving. Generally, the thinnest that you'll see is travertine, and it's about 1 inch. And generally with bluestone or other things, you'll see that very commonly the paving, it ranges in material that's about 1.5 inches to about 2.25 inches thick as sort of the common parts. We'll talk about this, especially when we look at granite, but because you want a level surface, any deviation from the depth of here at the surface has to be made up in the base course. So sometimes when you're laying the material, it's like you want everything to be flat here. You don't want to just lay everything here and have it be all, have a trip hazard essentially, but you might have to settle a little bit of a stone or pat it in a little bit more so that you end up with that uniform surface as you go through it. Other paving terms that are common to all natural stone. And remember when I said that sometimes those local material supply yards are awesome? Well, this was a great example. There was a spot that I had been to and found that had wonderful displays. They had everything labeled. I will say that when you get into some of the material, sometimes there is this tendency to just call something what they call it, and not necessarily, because there's not a genus and species necessarily for paving. So what I will say is sometimes you'll get into it and you'll see something that just says vintage. Well, if you look really closely, vintage is just travertine, but they like to call it vintage because it's sort of like, well, we sell this vintage paver, and it's just new travertine that comes out that way. So something to keep in mind. But surface textures is one of the other things that we'll look at. And as we look at those, there's 5 very common surface textures. First and foremost is what's called natural cleft. And natural cleft is the material as it comes out of the ground. We talked about it being a sedimentary material earlier. And so that sediment bed and basin, when you take the stone and you lift it out in a block and you move it this way and you pop a chisel in between and you start to break it apart, the part that you see on this side has some topography on it, and that's called the natural cleft face. That would be the most natural face, and it would be what it wants to present itself. It's before anything happens to it. That's the face that you see with no other work done to it. Secondly, it kind of takes from natural cleft, and that would be these faces here. You can kind of see a little bit more texture in them. Secondly, would be one called thermal. And thermal is basically taking natural cleft, applying a uniform, even heat to the surface, and pitting and popping so that that topography and that little bit of wiggle that's on top goes away, and you end up with a more uniform texture. Very grippy, but it's more of a pitted texture that's more like a dimpled piece of copper than it is a big piece of topography with a natural cleft. And then the other 3, gauged is a phrase and a term that we use, and that would be when the material is cut top and bottom, and it's exactly, no longer as it would be about like, well, some pieces might be 1/8 of an inch off or 1/16 of an inch off. When material is gauged, it's all gauged to the exact same thickness because it's sent through, it's basically sent through giant saws, and it would be exactly ground that way. So everything's more, it's more like working with actual tile than it is working with a natural stone. So it's a little bit of a good way to cheat when you're using natural material and get something that's faster to install. And then the last 2 would be honed. Honed is often something that's basically the top part is ground down with a diamond grinder, and the both sides would be ground that way. But when you're talking about something honed, it's often found in a countertop surface or something that might be used for a wall coping. Very, very smooth, tends to be a little bit more slippery, and you'll see that the grain essentially is sort of removed. And if you're a woodworker or you've worked with it, natural cleft would be basically rough sawn, and this would be basically sanding something down to about 200 grit or 400 grit. It's a lot smoother surface to it as you go through things. And then there's one that you'll sometimes see, and it's called tumbled. And tumbled is a little bit like, I don't know if you remember all the cars that were in like the mid 90s, everything looked like kind of like a jelly bean or a blob, right? They were all kind of roly-poly looking shapes. The old Ford Taurus was great for this, right? Because it just basically looked like a bean. Well, the tumbled material is a lot like taking material and just putting it into a large rock tumbler, essentially where people put them into rock polishers. Well, a piece that's been tumbled is going to take the edges off a little bit. It's going to be rounded, and all those highs and lows are going to be removed, and it's just going to be a much softer looking. Generally, they'll do it with seconds and extras because it's hard to do it with a larger piece, but the pieces that are smaller will sometimes be shaped. Quarries are amazing when it comes to making sure they sell every last little bit, from the slab to the aggregate to the grind to the even so to sometimes to the grit and the fines of it too. So as we keep looking through these, a couple of the other terms that you'll see with all natural stone paving would be the edge treatment things, and we'll go through 5 of these as well. Saw cut is your first, and that is just like it sounds, right? It's either the large saw from the quarry or it's a small saw that you have. I use a 4-inch angle grinder that I stole the idea from a mason that was local to here, because it was actually, I can get real detailed cuts because I use a lot of irregular bluestone. With a, or this is like a big like diamond cut edge. And so with a saw cut part, you'll see it's an unfinished edge, which is fine if you are essentially using that in tandem and putting the two pieces together. But it's not really the material edge that you want to see if you're treating it like it's the exposed surface. So saw cut is that. Two would be snap edge, and that's basically just a big hydraulic press. It's a little bit like taking a pretzel rod and snapping it, and you see sort of a very rough texture that's on there. It's not a fine cut, but basically that hydraulic press breaks the material along a certain plane, and then you end up with generally a convex and a concave shape as you split the material apart, and then you have that sort of face. So not super regular. Sometimes it takes a little bit of chiseling to get those two pieces to match back up. But if you want something a little bit more regular than that, if it's not just snap edge, which tends to be sort of like it snaps where it wants to, the rock face edge starts with saw cutting, and then you'll take a chisel edge and you'll dress that edge. Essentially, you'll run down it. I use a lot of Estwing hammers and some old chisels that I found from basically if I hit an antique store, I'm looking for old chisels and things because people don't generally sell them, and if they do, they're super expensive nowadays. So I have a cool set of old chisels, and there are some that are nice wide flat edges that you can dress rock face edging with. This actually looks like it was thermaled afterwards to make it a little bit more uniform. And 4 and 5, 4 is the bullnose edge. So if you just picture this like cross section like that, right? Normally it would just be a cut. Well, a bullnose edge is going to have this curvature to it as you go through it, and it's going to have this rounded edge to it. And then this has been thermaled also. Once you rock face something or once you bullnose it, it's going to have all those grinder marks, and you're going to want to remove those. And the thermaling process is a superheated torch. I've done it a couple times and I hate it because I don't have enough essentially like leather welding gear to keep those superheated pieces of stone from popping back onto me. So it's one of those things that you'll see the bullnosing part is thermaled on it, and then thermaled on a saw cut edge essentially is an edge that is just saw cut and then heat treated so that you have a little bit more of a dressed edge to it. We're going to go through bluestone, and then we're going to take a break in a moment here just to stretch our legs. But I wanted to look through the material for bluestone and kind of look at it as we go through our process, right? Our systematic approach to looking at all these materials. I would say the first thing we're going to look at is bluestone, and the other names that you'll hear it called by are like Pennsylvania or New York bluestone. Sometimes if it's irregular or even dimensional, some people will call it flagstone or flagging. It confused the heck out of me because I was used to calling it bluestone when I moved from the Midwest back to Pennsylvania. I had never really practiced out here until I moved back, and people would talk about flagging or flagstone. Well, in the Wisconsin area, flagging and flagstone is actually a light limestone material. When you move into out here, it was like, oh, people would just talk about bluestone that way. So there are some local colloquialisms that you hear about when you get into it. Category obviously would be natural stone, and then the manufacturing origin would be regionally quarried. You'll find most of it in American or domestic part are mostly going to come out of Pennsylvania and New York area because that's the geology that allowed those quarries to form the material to then be brought back out. And then when you talk about various quarry capabilities, you're going to talk about, there are quarries, right? There are quarries that are humongous, and there are quarries that are sort of a weekend enterprise with a person with a pickup truck that's collecting material to then sell to a distributor. So between a quarry that's a huge industrial, machine with a lot of resources, and a quarry that's a small, more of a casual outfit, there's a lot of capability differences. So sometimes that secondary manufacturing is not capable from the quarry, except from the larger quarries to come through it. So just to keep in mind, especially comes up when we talk about sandstone, not so much with bluestone. Bluestone, limestone, and some of the other ones are bigger enterprises because it's a bigger industry with more money behind it. Sandstone, sometimes it's a little bit more hit and miss, and you'll find it's just sort of like, I suppose, like, I'll use some weird examples, but if you've ever gone to the South and gone to a gas station, someone's like, would you like some boiled peanuts? And you're like, where else in the world do they eat this thing? Right? There's these weird local things that you'll find in sandstone. When we get to that, is a lot more like that material where it's just a weird regional thing. So from an ID standpoint, we'll jump into photos next slide here, but for the most part, when you're talking about bluestone, you're going to find a baseline of a blue color, right? It's going to be this baseline color. And then there's going to be some other color variations that are going to fall into it. It's a sandstone material. It's got a finely textured and uniform surface. and it's relatively uniform and a nice even face. So it really works with a lot of different things. The two things that we are going to look at in this part of it, and the next two, will be what's called irregular or stand-up bluestone, and then also dimensional paving. So I promised you images and lots of fun things to look at, and this is where we jump into this part. When we look at bluestone, we're going to start with irregular and stand-up bluestone. And essentially, what I like to think of it as, because it's fun, but it's also a little bit like, I don't know, all that much hair to pull out left, but sometimes it's a really hair pulling out exercise because it's a huge, large, heavy puzzle. You remember that picture that I showed you earlier with that guy named Stretch, who was 6 feet 7 inches tall and the 7-foot piece of bluestone? Well, if you look at this piece right here, it actually is the same as this piece here. This little scallop and scoop is the same as this scallop and scoop. So when I talk about it being a very large, heavy puzzle, sometimes you need to think about how to put this gigantic puzzle together. This is my patio. Actually, as it was in progress, I snapped a bunch of pictures that were to it. And, so you look at a big piece like this and you figure out, how can I get as many pieces to fit together nicely without driving yourself crazy and without cutting a lot of the material? Never really in only once or twice. I have a weird experience as I work with irregular bluestone. Almost every time I work with a pallet of it and I break open a pallet, I will break it open and there will be times where as many as 15 pieces will go down, and it just feels like they were the next natural piece to go next to each other. And generally you work with like the larger to the smaller pieces, but sometimes you look for these areas like this where it's like, well, this is a convex shape and you want to find another piece. There have been a number of times where I work with a pallet and it just happens to go down that way. It happens to fall down and go, and the next pieces go through it. But as we look at it, there's big random sizes. There's a lot of surface irregularities when you talk about irregular bluestone. And really, irregular bluestone is like it's a seconds or an imperfect material. If you look at this palette down below, that's dimensional bluestone that we'll talk about next. But the irregular bluestone is such that it's so large, you'd have to cut so much off of it. And sometimes the surface textures are so messed up that you really can't get a good piece of dimensional size without wasting a ton. So the industry and the quarries have looked at it and said, well, just sell it irregular and we'll let people work with it. And what you end up with is sometimes these big puzzle shapes and puzzle pieces that are there. But technically, it's a very, there's going to be more what I call topography. If you look at the top piece of a surface, there's going to be a lot more of this that are on the top of it than you'll find with dimensional bluestone as you go through it, because it's a secondhand material. Dimensional paving, on the other hand, is its well-behaved other sibling. So if I happen to be the ill-behaved sibling and I have two very well-behaved siblings, I'm the one that doesn't. So the dimensional paving typically is the stuff that's squared on all sides. And again, I mentioned before, sometimes depending on the palette, it's square. And sometimes the square is sort of like two sides are square and you have to do some work to shape it up. But essentially it's squared on those sides. The sizes start between about 12 by 12s up to about 3 by 4 sheets. The 12 by 12s, when you look at this and you look at the field of paving down below, they tend to look a little busy. So it's if you can avoid running those and having the small pieces, it tends to look a little nicer. And generally the dimensional sides start to come in about 6-inch increments. So essentially, if you think of irregular as a large, difficult puzzle, think of dimensional as a large, easier puzzle, and you'll be putting it together that way. As we look at the color ranges for bluestone, there's basically 3 families of color, and we'll look at full color first. In the last picture that was here, you see all the color deviation and color variety that's in it. Well, this is in irregular, and the other one was in dimensional. But full color, in and amongst the fact that it's called bluestone, there are blues and buffs and greens and lilacs and browns and oranges. The oranges actually are colors with a lot more, it's a lot more iron component in it. And so it's a color typically called rust. And I've had clients that have looked at it and said, I hate that color, get it all completely out. We once, at a place I worked at years ago, we actually saved for like a couple of years all of the orange pieces that were there. And the owner liked it so much that he made an entire rust colored bluestone patio because orange was his favorite color. So we sort of felt like it was kind of a neat thing. A lot of the same color, so that orangish brown part. If you don't like that part, that can be selected back out. And so you look at it and say what you end up with is called blue. And blue are the pallets that are in the back that are hand selected just for the blue tone. So you're going to end up with this sort of blue color only without the deviation of the other colors. It's a premium. It generally is sold just as the blue color, but because you're sorting through it so much, people charge you for that, and the quarries and the manufacturers will charge you for that. So you're getting what you're paying for at that point if you like it. And then the other one just to mention is lilac, and that's it's very common in the irregular and the stand-up parts. But because the material is quarried and it comes from a different location, even amongst the quarry, when people get down to what's called a certain vein, they might get down to it, and because the local geology all shifted to that to make a more purple bluestone, that might be all they're taking out of the quarry at that point is just the purple material. So a darker hue, more of a chocolatey color, and kind of a common thing to it. So we look at the insights part. One would be it's a dark material. This one looks a little bit lighter, but that's still because it's got some of the stone dust that was on it that was here. But generally, the darker the material, the hotter it is. We have 2 indoor cats and we have 2 outdoor cats. My 2 outdoor cats are the mousers. The 2 indoor cats sometimes will go outside as sort of a novelty if we let them out. But when they do, they find the hottest piece of bluestone and they rub around on it because it's warm and it's scratchy, right? They like that heat that comes off of it. It's great for the cat. It's not always great on bare feet. So it's something if you walk around in bare feet, sometimes that's one of the things that you'll just be aware of as it. I would say it's one of the materials that you would want to avoid salting with. Certainly there's calcium chloride and there's other snowmelt materials. But when you're salting this material, I guess I would say if you go back to the fact that it's a darker, hotter material, if after a snowfall you can remove the snow, solar will actually, you'll get some solar gain in this material where it will melt off in a relatively rapid amount of time. So if you're skimming off the snow to expose it to the solar and the sunlight that's there, it will essentially melt itself. But it's something to think about too, because if you do put salt or calcium chloride in on this material, oftentimes you either are going to ruin it, you're going to stain it, or you're going to have a lot of spring cleanup when it's all said and done. You're going to spend a little more time washing that down or wishing that you had not put calcium chloride down when you find that there's a stain that can't be removed. Again, versatile and timeless. It's one of these materials that really just stands the test of time. It's porous. So if you're thinking about this a little bit later in some of the structures, if you're using this as a countertop surface and there's some vegetable oil or a glass of wine or some, a stain or some food that gets onto it, there's a good chance that if you don't treat it right away, you're going to end up with a stain because it's going to go into that part. And then you've got to look at either, sealing it or cleaning it or living with the fact that it's a little bit more of a stain material because it is so porous as a sandstone. I would say it's sort of one of those things that's the benchmark for all the other paving options. And then it's also available as in other formats as well. So from an additional resource standpoint, we'll just look at this and then we'll take 5 minutes to take a break in a moment. But I would say there's Endless Mountain Stone Company is a great resource. That's an actual private quarry, but they do have a lot of good resources on their site. And then there's 2 public associations, the Pennsylvania Bluestone Association and the New York Bluestone Association also have a lot of information. This also should be on your handout as well. And we'll take a break with that in mind. So one thing that you'll notice in every one of the ones, I will always have a fun intermission slide, and it's something to look forward to. And in this case, let's all go to the lobby and get ourselves some snacks. When we come back, I'll set a timer for 5 minutes and we'll just jump right back in. But when we come back, we'll look at Indiana limestone, sandstone, granite, travertine, and then we'll summarize and we'll go from there. So I'll keep this on, but I'm going to play a little song here as we go, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Stands on golden sand that watches the ships that go sail somewhere the sea. Watch me. If I could fly like birds on high, quick to run, go see. Beyond the stars, it's near.
Hi, Greg. Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Do you have the closed caption thing set for this meeting?
I do. Is it distracting?
Well, I've been trying to shut it off the whole
What's that?
I've been trying to shut it off the whole time you've been talking. I thought it was
Oh
on
no,
my
it's actually
end.
mine just because I know sometimes it's a hard thing for if I grab something else to do it. Yeah, no, it's actually my setting for it. So sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. I mean, if that's the
Okay.
way you like to run it, that's fine.
No
I
problem.
thought it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
me.
Okay.
Okay, thank
Well, that was
you.
a 2 Bobby Darin song intermission break, and that's what we have for it. So we'll jump back into it for here. Welcome back as we look through things. I will always, this is a little Easter egg for it. I'll always have an intermission slide that ties into the end slide. And so today's, just as a spoiler, it's movie themed. So we'll go from there. As we jump back into it, we're going to look at Indiana limestone, and we're going to go back to our handy display area that's here. And the display area has all the different things that you can find in the, in the world of paving that's here. Indiana limestone is one that shows up as a very nice light color. And it's a little bit different as we're talking about things like bluestone and the material that you'd find as a domestic product from the East Coast. Indiana limestone, or generally just people will call it limestone, is also in the natural stone category, also regionally quarried, but instead of being Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and and New York, essentially in that part, you're talking about it being towards the Midwest from Indiana standpoint. So regionally quarried, but a little bit smaller area. And the various quarry capabilities that fall into the Indiana limestone area generally, if you ever see that joke about like people posting on Marketplace and like, hey, I know what I got. Well, Indiana limestone knows what they have, and their quarries are big, large, big economic powerhouses. They generally have a lot of dollars and resources, and they can generally do a lot of things with it because their material is going on skyscrapers and it's being shifted into architectural products. It can be processed almost indefinitely into every other thing. There's one quarry here that I'll show you in sandstone that actually does what people do in most of the limestone quarries, but it can be processed almost indefinitely, and it's a historic product for it. From an ID standpoint, light gray and white in color. So you're going to find a much, much lighter tone, and you're going to find it's very uniform and very consistent, whereas sandstones and bluestones are going to be similar. If you were to cut a piece essentially through it, it's going to be very much consistent through the whole part. You're not going to find a lot of deviations in the material as you slice through it. And it really is only processed by taking out big blocks and slicing them into smaller blocks or some other parts. Or there's other ways to manufacture that part, but that's most of the way that you'll see it. A very smooth and a very durable surface as you go through it. From a dimensional paving standpoint, I don't find it to be a super common paving in every garden, but when you do see it, it's generally in a little bit more formal or a little bit more tailored setting. But a lot of times you'll find it in the 12 by 12 up to 2 by 3 category in these increments to it. One of the things that's nice with limestone is a custom order can always go back to the quarry. If somebody that's selling the material or repping it, they'll always have a good supply chain to go back to it and say, hey, we want this really definitive shape or size. And there's always a nice communication chain to go back to the manufacturers or the point of origin where they can cut you that specific shape size. Again, it's very smooth and precise. It's a premium material. So whereas bluestone's a little bit more common and can be used in a lot of ways, Indiana limestone is typically used in higher settings. One thing I will say, and everybody see this little pockmark that's here, it's one of the things I'm going to come back to with Indiana limestone. There's a little bit of a divot right here in this nice material where this is all mortared in place, because it's very durable when you get it in the ground, but getting it in the ground, you have to be careful handling it because it can be a little bit fragile as you go through it. So it's very easy to ding, dent, and damage as you work through it. And as a result, mostly it's handled by more experienced masons and trades that have worked with it and recognize the danger of getting it dirty or dinging it along the way. In terms of the terms and features, and again, this will be on your handout part, the color range that we look at really falls into three things. Up on top, you're going to see buff pavers, and the buff paving is going to be in that warm hue. It's a little bit nicer in terms of the warmth part. And if you were to look at it from I don't know if anybody's done different graphics classes, but if you were to look at the warm grays or the French grays, you'll see that the warm grays is going to be like a warm gray 10 or 15 or 20 value on the buff side. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, the gray paver is going to be a more of a cooler gray, and it's going to be a little bit brighter and lighter. So this one on the bottom will be a little bit more on the cold side. This one on the top will be a little bit on the warm. But meeting in the middle, of course, is our variegation or our buff and gray color. Whereas this is a little bit of the both. If you remember when we talked about bluestone, full range is like, whoa, there's a lot of color in it. When you look at full color here, it's like, I guess I can see that there's a couple colors in there. You'll see it on bigger sheets and bigger pieces of it that the variegation does come out. But generally, the variegated parts will have some of the buff, some of the gray, and a little bit of an introductory, like a blending color between the two. And as you look at the material insights for it, you'll oftentimes see that there's a cost component. Indiana limestone is generally it tends to be a more costly material just based on the fact that it's a small industry. It serves everything from skyscrapers and big buildings, and it can also be used as a paving material, but that's a very secondary use. It's a real use, but it's a secondary one. And when you think about the quarries being able to ship this material off to whomever they want, they can sell it as that, but oftentimes the cost is like, well, we can sell it for whatever we want because it's, because we can get that material for it. What I would say is that the lead times, especially on custom orders, are something to be considerate of. If you are just buying material that's off the shelf and it's available, fine, you'll be able to get that material now. And for the most part, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, I mean, it's been coming off and coming out of the quarries to the point where the quarries are very deep and sunlight doesn't always hit the bottoms of them. But you'll be able to predictably source this material regularly. And if you need a custom order, you can generally do it, but it's going to take some time to fabricate it. But again, as we talked about it, even on things like this, it requires some careful preparation and handling, because if you were to ever knock those two sides together, it's like, oh man, now you either got to cut that piece off, or you got to dress that edge, or you got to do something to try and hide it. It's very easy to damage a piece as you go through it until it's in the ground, and then it's fine. Generally, it's mortared in place. These are larger pieces that are going to be used as slab steps. And from an availability part, you'll also see it oftentimes used as steps or veneer or architectural uses as well. And then from a resource standpoint, Indiana Limestone Company and Indiana Limestone Institute are two good resources. The Indiana Limestone Company is a privately held for-profit organization that sells the material. The Institute is more of the industry association, and they're good about promoting it and making sure that everybody knows what a wonderful material it is. And then there's also another private one that's there that's got some great resources, and that's called Select Stone Supply as well. And that's a super, super helpful group that's there. So related to, we've done bluestone, we've looked at limestone, now we look at sandstone. Now the two so far, bluestone and limestone, have been pretty legitimate enterprises. And I don't mean to like badmouth sandstone, but in my experience, sandstone is sometimes one of those materials where you're like, like I saw this material once over here and I liked it, but I went back to the material yard and they were like, yeah, I don't think it was here. Maybe it was here. We don't have that anymore. And so it's not always the case. Sometimes there are very, very predictable supplies of it. But sometimes, especially when you get into the regional variants, we'll talk about, from the material family, it is a natural stone. And people will generally call it sandstone, but it's a little bit like saying a car, right? A car could be a lot of different things. It could have, it could be a $250,000 luxury vehicle, or it could be a $2,500 starter car that that you run around and do things with. But sandstone's kind of funny with it because it's so regionally quarried and so found in so many areas. It can be very, very diverse in the way it comes out. And so you'll see a lot of variation in the quarry capabilities of who's supplying it. And oftentimes you'll get a small regional quarry and they find a distributor in their material yard. And so they'll produce, but they'll sell it to maybe one or two material yards, right? So that'll be their distributors. Well, if those two distributors are, either they run out or they stop producing it, it's no longer available. And so between the local geology that changes and the fact that it's available in so many different places and can go into different spots, you'll sometimes see those local variants are very, they're there and then they're not. And sometimes they're not always predictable and easy to replicate or find again. The other thing I would say is that that falls into one category of sandstones. The other one are international tiles that are brought in, that are produced overseas, brought back in on pallets. They're a little bit more precise and a little bit more predictable, but they also range. And sometimes a material yard that's buying them and bringing them in, you saw that paver that was called vintage. It was actually travertine earlier. It's like that. People will oftentimes put their own little brand name on it, and they'll sell it as like a sunset paver or a rainbow paver. And you're like, I've never heard that before. What is this actually? Like, what is it geologically called? So from an ID characteristic, you'll generally see that it's a warmer earth tone. It sometimes will include some wild variegations, some very different things. Like sandstone is a big family, and within that family, there's a lot of characters into it. And so depending on where you are across the country and where you're finding it and sourcing it, there might be a high variation. And probably one of the better ways to look at it is, we've got this limestone that was up above. That's a very pitted limestone from Wisconsin. This is bluestone and a thermal finish. Well, this starts to fall into your sandstone category, and it's got this wild, almost fossil-like, pattern that's there that came up in the surface. And so when we look at sandstone as a family, we're seeing that in the irregular and rustic paving, it's a little definitive. When we talked about irregular with bluestone, it's like you could still see it's related to bluestone. With sandstones, sometimes the irregular stuff is, you wouldn't be able to find a big enough piece because they're smaller, more brittle pieces oftentimes, and you're not able to quarry them out because they don't have necessarily the same economic driver that the big industries of limestone and bluestone have behind them. So because they don't have the same material driving them, it becomes a little bit more colloquial or folksy to use some of the sandstones that are regional to an area, which sometimes is nice and sometimes is maddening. Think of it as, like, from an irregular standpoint, as an earth tone alternate to irregular bluestone. So you'll get that same kind of puzzle shape, but there's going to be more in the browns and earth tones and the warm tones that you'll find in the brown family and buffs and beiges, and not necessarily in the blues that you'll find in the geological bluestone parts. The other thing to consider is that, especially on the irregular pieces, you'll oftentimes find, because those are the big, you kind of just have to sell it as is. Sometimes the face is a little bit more brittle. Sometimes it's more rough. It's a little bit more rustic. I've seen some crazy sandstones that are like, I wouldn't even consider using it because they don't seem like you'd be able to set anything but a three-legged stool on them and hope it would balance. So from that standpoint, sometimes the sandstones, and again, not a hard and fast rule, but it's sort of a generalism of it. Sometimes they're a little bit more jagged and irregular, but sometimes you go to the place that you'll buy materials from, and it's like, oh, that actually is kind of a nice material, and you'll find it. On the dimensional side of it, however, sandstones, and there's everything I said about like dumping on sandstone. When I show the manufacturer at the very end, that's a local category. It's a local manufacturer to here. They actually do with sandstone what Indiana limestone does with limestone, but they just do it locally. It's about an hour north of my house in central PA. And they're CNC milling. Like I went there one time and saw they were CNC milling a shrine that took about 3 weeks to just do one piece as they carved out each piece. So it certainly can be processed if you find the right place. But things like this, remember we said it, like you'll find these different name variations. Golden Sunset Paver. Well, that's not like, it sounds more like a plant name for somebody that named a named a plant of the week as opposed to a paver name. But because the materials are sometimes found and sourced to the local yards, they'll call it something in order to be able to market it and sell it. And so whoever comes with the most clever name comes up with it. So you'll see things like Sahara Gold. These are actually imported. This and this are domestically. I think this comes out of Tennessee, and I think this does as well to it, if I remember right. But you'll oftentimes find that in the dimensional material, it's a little bit smaller pieces. So you'll find things like 12 by 12s up to 2 by 2s, a little bit smaller dimension than some of the bluestone or limestone. And again, that just goes down to the quarry capabilities. And then you'll see things like the smooth surfaces and the gauge thicknesses and S4S parts that are, more like actual tiles, so to speak. And oftentimes the thicknesses are about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. The Penn State campus, we're actually spoiled because here at the University Park campus, it's nearby. We actually, I'll show you in a minute. There's the company that's relatively local to here is a sandstone company. But when you look at the material itself, you'll see that it's highly variable. You can see the kind of striping and the different striations that are here. In this case, it's used with a very warm concrete paver. So it sort of, blends in nicely because these slab steps can be custom cut and processed to make it work. Reliability, sometimes again, like we said, you won't always find the same exact material available year to year, or you may not always, because sometimes the supply chain isn't always as predictable. So it is always helpful to visit local suppliers and kind of spend some time asking and seeing, like, hey, can we get this? How long have you been selling it for? Do you think you'll be selling it in another couple of years? Is there anything there? Like maybe asking some of those questions is helpful. And then when you get down to the things that are tile set, or it's gauged, or it's been more built like a tile, sometimes that becomes a very uniform. If someone's going to go to the process or the headache of making something more tile set, it's because they generally have a nice supply of the material and they're comfortable producing it that way over and over and over. So keep in mind when it comes to sandstone, irregular tends to be very rustic, right? When I talk about topography, I'm talking about the top piece of the material, and the topography of irregular can be very rustic and have a lot of topo, and the pieces of tile set can be, just like tile would be in any other material. Also, it can be available as boulders or wall stone. And then this is sort of the curveball, right? There's a company, if you ever wanted to find out more and find out some of the really amazingly things that you can do with sandstone, Russell Stone Products in Grampian, PA is the company that they're about an hour north of central PA. Everything I said bad about sandstone, or I should say bad, everything I critically critiqued about sandstone, if they heard me say that, they would take me to task, because that is a manufacturing company that has a beautiful supply. They own a tremendous amount of land, and you can just see from the scale, this is the same scale that you can bring out, and their material legitimately goes around the world. People will source things and put it in their spec from Russell Stone Products. And it's a very nice family-run organization. They're super good people. But again, they're the exception because they've found a great supply. They were industrious enough and entrepreneurial enough to be able to make something amazing out of that part of it as we go through. So we're going to look at two more materials. We're going to take a look at granite cobble, and then we're also going to wrap up with travertine and just a few other thoughts as we go through to it. I feel like travertine is like this thing like lurking in the back, like, we're going to jump out more travertine. But it's not as bad as I make it out to be. It's just, you have to use it with a grain of salt as you're thinking about it. Granite cobble, sometimes you'll hear it called just granite or cobblestone or Belgian block. Once upon a time, so I understand, it was used as the ballast in ships, right? So when they floated across it, it was meant to sort of do that, and then it was ejected out. Well, granite cobble's been around for a long time. I recognize that there are granite countertops. There can be granite paving. This mostly is focused a little bit more in on what I would say is the residential scope or the residential scale. So a little bit more softer scale and more intimate scale of things. I don't generally see a ton of granite being used in the residential scale. It's not to say it's not used in terms of flat paving or big sheets, but oftentimes what I do see is that this granite cobble or cobblestone is something that's used as an accent in a lot of residential landscapes. So that's why I included it and excluded things that might necessarily be lumped in with like kitchen countertops, et cetera, with that. So from a regional quarrying standpoint, again, we have a natural stone, it's regionally quarried. And in the story of granite, there's really this idea of domestic and international. Domestically, we've got New York, and it's one of the ways that we'd find it nearby. You'll see it in this picture that's along here. A lot of times you'll hit a vein of like what's called salt and pepper, and we'll see the colors in a minute of different granite cobbles and the sizes. But a lot of times you'll see domestic parts, and because of the geology, you're going to go overseas and find what's called a black granite, and that can be brought over. Or you might go down to Mexico and see what's like a red granite that can be brought up and used. And it's a little bit, you'll find these regional variations really affect where the color availability comes from with them, because of the geology is a little bit bigger as it comes down to granite. So when we look at the granite cobble, you're going to find it being a smaller sort of format rectangular block. If you've ever picked one up with one hand, you're like, it is ridiculously dense, ridiculously heavy, and a very, very difficult material to work with, because it's this stubborn little billet of stone that only wants to be a block of stone. Like it doesn't really want to behave and play nice. It's hard to cut. But when you use it in the right format and the right setting, it's very, nicely used. I oftentimes in northern New Jersey, where I grew up, you'll oftentimes see it used as a curbing very regularly. Instead of, I very seldom would I ever see in this area a poured concrete curb, but what I will see oftentimes is a mortared concrete curb, because it's as or more durable than a concrete curb, and you can just put it in segmentally, and you don't need special equipment. You just need to know how to mix mortar into it too. So heavy and dense, rough and angular, semicircular or semi-irregular faces. There's an image a couple slides ahead that shows it being installed as sort of a rumble strip area. And I'll talk more about that, but just keep that semi-irregular face in mind. And oftentimes it's used as a curbing or an inlay for it. As we look at granite cobble, there's basically on the industry standard size, they keep it mostly to these three sizes. And I'll start backwards and say jumbo. Jumbo is the big one, and sort of like when you get into jumbo, we were saying like size-ish. I don't like to say size-ish, but it's like 4 to 6 inch-ish sizes, 6 to 8 inch-ish sizes by about 10 to 15 inch sizes. So jumbo is this big, irregular, cumbersome, big, large slab. It's about the largest that you'll get for these cobble pieces. And if you go backwards from there, a cobble itself would be like a 5 by 5 by 9. And everybody sort of recognizes and says, like, you might measure this and get it's 5 1/4, or you might see 4 7/8. You might see 5 on the nose. But for the most part, because it's a little bit, wonky in terms of sizing, you're going to see it's roughly a 5 by 5 by 9. And when you install it, the gap between the pieces, right? If this is a piece and this is a piece, the gap between it has to make up the difference. So sometimes it's a little wider, sometimes it's a little narrower, and that's how you have to use this material. And then a cube is like a 4.5 by 4 by 4 or 5 by 5 square, essentially. And sometimes people use those in fan patterns and other stuff to it, but those are generally the 3 big sizes for the granite cobbles. You'll see it as sometimes as dimensional pavers and curbing, but in this setting, we're going to mostly focus in on it. When we look at color ranges, it's interesting to me. Now, I'm technically colorblind in the red-green deficiency. And so if I were to look at someone puts red marking paint or a red ribbon in a green field, like I'll find it, but it takes a minute. So when I talk about the colors, it's kind of amusing to me because the colors that everybody sees aren't necessarily the colors that everybody calls it. So what most people will agree on is a salt and pepper granite is black and white. It's kind of got that high contrast and peppered mark of a white base with little black pepper marks into it. And that's generally your salt and pepper part. Where it gets a little bit more confusing is 2. You can see this is 2, and this is also 2. Sometimes that's called out as gray on a website. And it makes it even worse if you're looking at it not as an actual sample, but off of a screen. And if you're an Android user or an Apple user, your screen resolution might be different if it's on a laptop or if it's on a desktop or if it's on a phone or an iPad or a tablet. So sometimes those colors, it makes it super important to see the material in person and make sure that you know what it is. So gray can sometimes be, generally it's a more uniform and a cool tone, but sometimes it's dark gray and sometimes it's lighter gray or a different color altogether. Generally the pinks in terms of number 3, again, you look at this and I've seen people call this more of a pink range where I'm like, that's clearly gray to me, but what do I know? I'm colorblind, right? And then this part is more like in the pink and light and soft red hue, generally like a Mexican stone or a Mexican granite. That's oftentimes people will see that and they'll know that's a red granite. Like it's very clearly a reddish, pinkish hue. But then when you look at things like black is that dark gray tone. This is what I would call black granite, but I have also seen people calling black granite this number 4. And it's like, well, clearly this is a light gray and clearly that's a black. But again, because there is no uniform standardization of what this is, and there's no USDA rating on it, no one's looking over their shoulder. They're saying, well, I mean, that's black, and right, we have it, and so we're just going to call it that, and somebody else might call it a different color. So a little bit of a free-for-all when it comes to the colors, and just something to be aware of as you work with the material itself. We talked before about this one image. Again, when some insights as to working with granite, it's heavy and dense and it's difficult to cut. You'll have to cut through an entire piece and chisel the edges. You can certainly chisel the edges off to hide the saw cut mark, but you'll see every piece along here was cut and then you're chiseling the edges back afterwards to it. But it's difficult to work. It does not behave the same way that bluestone is. If I had to cut the tombstone headstone for my niece and nephew's rabbit, I would not have chosen bluestone or granite to do. I would have chosen a material that's easier to work with it. A rough surface. So think about it from a standpoint of you're walking on it and you're driving on it. If you're walking on it, it's a little bit uncomfortable under your feet, but if you're driving on it, it slows you down because you hear this rumbling like entry, like a brrr, as you roll your tires across it. A lot of times people will use it as an inlay in a driveway, and people will use it as a pedestrian part because it is a rougher texture, and it will cause people even mentally, they will slow down when they see this material a little bit more when they hit it, because it's a little bit more rumbly and it's a little more texture and tactile as you go through it. So not my first choice for like a paving in like a patio setting, because it would be very difficult to actually level your table on it or move a chair back if you scooted back up off it. But for a pedestrian surface where you're just walking across it or driving across it, it's a very nice, because it's also very durable. and can do a lot of things with it. One thing that I'll always, again, kind of think about the snow removal consideration of using this material. If you were to drop a plow blade on it, or if you were to use a shovel, the metal shovel is going to be just insanity. You're going to always pick it on an edge, and you're always going to hit. So using something like a soft, like a plastic edge to it, or a plastic shovel to take it off there, and knowing that you're going to have some snow and ice built up along the joints is something to consider with it too. We talked about it being mortared as curbing, oftentimes a very high cost per square foot because it's heavy and hard to work with. Oftentimes you'll find that the material itself is not terribly expensive, although it can range up there, but the labor of working with it can drive up into it, because people are going to be going through saw blades and spending some time. It's not a fast installation. There's some time invested into it in working with this. So as a result, it's generally not the whole field of it, but it's very used as a detailing, as an accent, as a border, as an inlay. And we'll look at like the Bear Granite Association is a good resource for further study. They've got a whole heritage and a whole lineage of working with granite, how to produce it, how to work with it. Again, it's something that oftentimes is quarried and used for buildings, and again, in a lot of urban uses. And the Bear Granite Association is a nice resource for it. So our last material for the night is travertine. And I was just down in, where was it? Pompano Beach, Florida. We went down there to work for a couple of days. And the place that we stayed at had a huge interior courtyard. And I looked down and it's like, I have to get a picture of it. I didn't include that picture in this, but it was the most travertine I have ever seen in one installation. And you could tell that they did it in two different parts and they ran out of material, because after this one field ended, it was like, here's color warm, here's color cold. And there was no like filtering or effort. It was just like, well, that's where this material stopped. And now we got to buy this other stuff. And it was like this really awkward, really awkward transition as you looked at the material. Something a stone nerd would look at and go like, I know what you did there. And most people would look at it and go like, it's just the patio, and they'd look at the stuff they're supposed to look at there. But with travertine, you're mostly talking about international sourcing. A lot of times when I first saw this material, it was probably 20 years ago, and they called it Jerusalem stone when it came through, because it had this feeling of like the material that was used in Israel. And so places like that where it's mostly international sourcing and it's coming in from overseas. Well, with that, generally, sometimes the places that it comes in from overseas are not always as adept to the freeze-thaw cycles as we are in the temperate East Coast regions. So where I am most concerned with this material, and I would never say don't use it, but I would say use it sparingly and use it cautiously and thoughtfully. You'll look at it, and we'll get to that point in a minute, but light earth tones, warm colors, very, very like embracing, super warm, like really wonderful looking material, very dense and very, very hard to work with. So sort of a marbled surface appearance, but you'll see this presence of these pits and holes and little tiny spots in it. And I'll get to that more in one moment, but I just wanted to say also it's very brittle and very difficult to field dress. So what I mean by field dress is if you were to cut this material and then say, oh, I want to put a new bullnose on it, like good luck. It's not going to happen in the field, because it takes such a specialized and heavy factory manufacturing that you're not able to replicate that with hand tools in the field on the fly as you were to cut something. So for instance, if you were to say a bluestone material, and you have to like, you come across the site and you're like, oh, I realize we got to notch it. We got to notch it over here. Not a big deal with bluestone, but it can be a little bit more challenging with travertine because it's a little bit more resistant. It's so dense of a material. But I talked about those pock marks. And one of the things I want to talk about and just kind of come back to is the fact that these pock marks, sometimes they go like a water slide through the material, and sometimes they're just little pits on the surface, and you never really know. But based on the fact that this is more like a fossilized and more material, sometimes if that water sits in there, and if you're familiar with the freeze-thaw cycle, if water sits in there and it traps inside this volume and then it freezes, it's going to want to pop. And so you're going to end up with this very nice smooth surface that oftentimes people think about as being very friendly on the feet, a wonderful pool deck material. Well, if it does happen to build up a lot of freeze-thaw, you run the risk essentially of seeing this material pop and pit on the surface a little bit more. Not always the case, but it's one of those be aware ofs if you were to use this material. From an industry standard point of view, it's always going to be sold on a pallet, and the pallet's going to have mixed sizes, but they're going to be smaller. The smaller pieces range down to like 8x8, and that's about like the smallest piece. And they're going to go up to about a 2x2. That's going to be about the biggest piece. I don't think I've ever seen a piece bigger, but I see most things in that like 18 to 24 inch size 2x2s. And because it's so dense, it's about an inch thick, and that has the strength of a much thicker piece of stone because it's a much more dense material to it. So a couple things to think about through it. With the color range, you're going to find 3 primary color ranges of it. You'll see this sort of factor in the natural materials. You'll sort of see like a light consistent, a dark consistent, and then the 2 meeting in the middle. And that's the case with this too. In the color range for here, you'll see tans and creams, and that's kind of in this range. They're very warm and very like earthy parts on the lighter side. You'll also see things that are in the browns side here, where it's a little bit more on the darker part. This is where I was talking about with the material, where it just sort of stopped and it went from cream to brown. You're like, oh man, like it looked funny because we were on the 4th floor looking down at it, and probably not as evident as we were looking at if you were on that ground level. And then there's also some warm grays and some colors where it's a little bit more mottled in between. But again, just thinking through it, one thing I would note too is a lot of times when you see it installed, because of this presence of these pits and pockets, most people will lay it on a very tight base. They will put the 2 pieces together, and they will not sand the joints. We'll talk about this in the 4th session when we talk about construction methodology. But if you were to sand the joints, especially if you were to make the mistake of using what's called polymeric sand on the joints, polymeric sand is what I just generally call sticky sand. You put it down, you sweep it in the joints, and then you water activate it, and it fills the joints, and it's malleable and movable, but it acts like a soft mortar or like a soft grout. It can still flex, but everywhere that the water hits it, if it hasn't been brushed off completely, it's going to be very difficult to use. So oftentimes travertine is never sand swept, and it's never added with polysand. It can be mortared in place, but I've never seen anybody polymeric sand it, because every one of these sand holes would completely fill, and then you end up with a sticky sand surface that the sand is where you don't want it to be at that point. One other term that you'll see in a lot of things in the literature for engineered products, for instance, you'll see the coefficient of friction sometimes is laid in there. And sometimes the coefficient of friction comes in when a lawsuit comes into mind. And it's like, well, what were you thinking with this slippery material? A low number essentially is more slippery, and a high number is less slippery. Travertine falls on the lower number side, where it tends to be a little bit more of a slippery surface. So in the wintertime, if you are doing snow melt or things like that, this is going to be a little bit more of a, I'll say, an interesting experience to walk across it on a wet surface, as opposed to walking on something that's got a little bit more texture. And again, when you're talking travertine, you're always talking about the surface holes and the pitting that comes into it. From a material insight standpoint, there are some lighter colors to consider. And with those lighter colors come cooler temperatures. That's why people love this as a pool coping. Probably not so much as an irregular pool coping, because you really can't manufacture this and custom cut it in the field. It would have to be templated and then sent to be cut that way, but great for a straight line coping. And it's very smooth. And actually, when you put your hand on it, because of that low coefficient of friction, if you were to sit on this and slip into the pool, say it was a pool coping, or you were to put your hand on it and kind of roll your hand over it, there's a very great feeling to the material itself. It's very receptive and very nice and tactile from that standpoint. So from a pool decking or coping use, it's wonderful. It's thin and it's difficult to work in the field. We've mentioned that before. And then, always keep in mind the porosity of it and the freeze thaw. You can spill stuff generally on this, and it's not terribly, but it'll sink into those holes, and that freeze thaw can be problematic with it. And so snow removal can be kind of a consideration. I don't know if it ever stayed this way. One of the largest installations I had ever worked on with this was a very large residential home in southern North Illinois, like the southern part of northern Illinois. And they used it as a primary paving. I think they went back years afterwards and may have switched it out in some of the other areas because they had issues with it. But I would just sort of, they had tough winters, and I think it played a role into it in the front yard. They kept it more in the backyard as a result, where they didn't have to clear snow so much. And so just keeping in mind that coefficient of friction for it too. Travertine's funny. If you go online and you start looking at different resources and different things about travertine, most people just want to sell you the product. Like you'll even see it sold at different material yards. They don't necessarily want to tell you a lot about it. The only real great resource I've found for this is the National Stone Institute's Travertine and Building Materials course. Like if you're ever bored and you want some fun reading, that's a great way to get, to fall asleep, is to read that course. But they do have some great information about the travertine as an actual material for it too. So as we look at our section summary and we go into this part, we're looking at this and saying travertine's kind of a niche product. It sort of advertises or illustrates all that's fussy in the world of natural stone pavers. From the pro standpoint, all natural products, in my mind, there's a natural beauty that's inherent in the material itself. If you were to cut through it or slice through it, you're going to find that it's a beautiful, and that color goes all the way through the material. We'll see as we get into the concrete pavers, if you were to take a cross section of the material and cut it, sometimes there's a surface mix, there's a wearing course, and there's a binder course at the bottom. So if you were to cut it, you're going to see the cross section of material, and it's going to be like a parfait. Well, with bluestone or with natural stone or any of the ones that we've talked about today, you split it open, and all you're going to see is more of the same color inside, just at a different texture. So that beauty runs more than skin deep. It goes through the material, and it is what it is there. That inherent color is throughout the material. The parallel I oftentimes make for people is that it is parallel to hardwood flooring as opposed to the click lock or LVT flooring, where that's a manufactured surface and it's thin to be applied on the surface. If you've worked with or been around natural hardwood, if you were to cut that piece, you'd still see that maple goes all the way through it, or white oak goes all the way through it. Whereas in another material, it would be sectioned off that way and be an engineered part. So oftentimes, it's a pro or it's a con, but I put it in the pro category. It's preferred, it's beautiful. It does require some specialty knowledge to work it and to install it a little bit. And then I throw the cons gently in this list in terms of working with natural materials. I'll play my hand a little bit. I think there are some wonderful things with engineered products, but I think they still will always be playing catch up and pretending to be until they start. And there are a couple companies that do this. A concrete product is awesome when it wants to be a concrete product. When it tries to imitate stone, it's always going to be a shadow of what it actually is. So when we think about the cons, so to speak, of natural materials, people will say that they're imperfect, they're inconsistent, they're sometimes costly. But I would say that as maybe are better called awarenesses of using natural stones than necessarily cons. So that's a good segue into next week's. Next week, we're going to pick up and we're going to go into manufactured paver products. We're going to go 2 parts. We're going to spend the beginning part of it. We will do a little bit of time to look at the design intro for the design challenge next week. We'll sort of introduce the site and give you some time to start thinking through it. But the thing we're going to start with is clay products, because clay is natural but processed. And then we're going to switch gears. So we'll go natural stone, clay, which is natural but processed and engineered into something. And then we'll go into concrete, which is a much more engineered part that has a lot of R&D and a huge marketing beast behind it to try and make sure that everybody buys concrete products and forgets how beautiful natural stone is. I don't want to give too much into that part of it, but they have come leaps and bounds with working with the material. Manufactured products exist basically to compensate for the perceived shortcomings of a natural paver. And so whereas people say that it's slow or it's hard to work with, all the manufactured products we're going to look at next week are very uniform and have tight tolerances. So if you can set a base course and you can get material in, then you can start working with this material, and there's a much higher production rate that comes up with it. So we'll pick up next week with that. We'll start a little bit of time with the design challenge, and we'll look at the introductory to manufactured products. I will, as I said, we're right at time here, but I will stick around for a few minutes. If anybody has questions, I'd be happy to chat for a few minutes. And I just wanted to say thank you for listening to me yap at you for the last 90 minutes. I appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us with it. And if you have any questions, like I said, stick around for here. Feel free to always use the Brightside app that's there and use that the classroom setting. And I'll check that, of course, especially as we get into the design challenge. I'll always check that more so that we have time to look through it. We said we stayed with a movie theme, and we're going to stick with the movie theme because that's the Back to the Future to be continued. So we'll pick up on the next time there. So I'll hang out here, stop sharing my screen, and we'll go from there.
I have a question.
Yes. First off, I have a question too. What's your name?
Kelly Cabina.
Haley, hi, how are you?
How are you? For the different kinds of materials, will you talk at all about how they might be used in different styles of landscape design? I'm literally just off last Thursday. I was doing Asian inspired garden design. So
Yeah.
full of thoughts about that.
Yeah, and so I'll give you a couple of things. I mean, actually, I'm not going to talk a ton about the different styles in this class, but I will tell you, if you go on to, I'm actually working on a project right now. I don't say this is like a thing that it blew my mind that I get to work on a project in Puerto Rico right now, and they're in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, and it's somebody I've known for years. Well, I start everything by looking at the stylistic things because I know that, like, my preference, I love irregular bluestone and a very organic kind of layout, but I also like having an underlying geometry that falls through the design. So yes, I mean, what I'd tell you is, if you want to look through some of the things on some of my social media or some of my other parts, there are a really diverse set of either plan views or renderings. And I start every project with an idea of, stylistic A, stylistic B. Sometimes people will choose something from column A and column B, and they'll try to marry them up a little bit. But stylistically, yes. I mean, I will try to. The class that we're actually, or the project that we're actually going to use as the example for the design challenge has been funny for me. The family they're a very nice and very interesting couple, but their family has a bluestone quarry in their group, right? And they thought initially, oh, we're going to open up the quarry and we're going to get our stone back up and running. Well, they come to find out that the family, or that family member that was there, is like, well, we kind of shut that down. We don't have any labor. So we've pivoted a couple times. And stylistically, when it comes down to things like the hardscape, I think we had a pretty good example and pretty good like tailored way to go through it. I was fortunate enough to work on the design of the house, so I was able to design the actual home itself, site it, put it on the property, and place it on the area. So I kind of knew I had a nice insight as to what they looked and liked for it. But if it were my house, I might have taken a different tactic and gone with something very organic and blending into it, and related more to the site because it's a wooded site. And I could also give them some parts that were very linear. It's a mid-century modern home, so very linear. And I took some tips from them where they talked about courtyards and things. And I'm like, oh, well, let's see where it goes. So we won't go into a ton of the stylistic parts, but you'll see styles in every one of the images. And like I said, always feel free to look at my stuff that I have on Marengo Pass, and you'll see a breadth and depth of things that are there. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I also did put in the chat, if you don't look at it, that my son calls the 90s cars melted cheese. So he's an automotive restoration student. So
Okay. Yeah.
I have a short question, I think. I'm Carly.
Hi, Carly. How are you?
Hi, good, thanks. I think I just wanted to confirm, so is the last class you're going to maybe help us think through how to put the pieces together, like the right materials? Because you just talked about how polymeric sand's not good for that like kind of porous one, but it might be good for other things.
Yeah, I will. I'll spend more time in the fourth one. Probably two things will come up in the construction methodology part. In that section, I'm going to go through, and again, always pepper me with questions as we go into it, but I'll spend time going into the general methodology of how things go together. I always feel like that's kind of a nice awareness, because if you're working with a material and it's I've never really felt comfortable just knowing what a material is. It's how to use it effectively. So I'll touch based on some of those methodology things. And if need be, we can always chat about the things that are there with it as we go through. I think we have some general construction details, but I think in the most part, I've tried to keep it more to the images of the actual installations and the construction process, because it's easier to look at in a picture than it is to do a section or diagram for it. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Sure, absolutely.
Hello, it's Susan. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you, Susan?
Good. Are you going to give us examples of like how to calculate materials that you would need? Like if you have to buy overage for stuff?
I can. So what I found is I generally forget it as soon as I need it. Like I'll keep it as a record, but sometimes like I don't store always that into my head. But one of the things that'll come up oftentimes is like the tonnage of irregular bluestone translates into a square footage. But what I have found is that um, it's very variable between one supplier and another supplier. And so if they're ranging, I I guess I would say is I would always give you like there's things where it's easier to do with aggregate, because aggregate is a you basically take area and you calculate the area, then you create a volume and you divide it by 27, and that gives you your cubic yards. And then you factor in compaction. So it's easier to do with aggregate because that's a standard. With things like irregular bluestone, sometimes a pallet, depending on the pallet itself, a pallet could be like this, pallet could be like that, pallet could be like this. And so what I've oftentimes is I've noticed on the stone supply yard that I go to that's local here, they'll write a tonnage number on it, and that tonnage number generally equates to a coverage. And I don't remember what it is. I think I generally figured out, like with irregular stand-up bluestone, it's about 70 square feet per pallet. So I generally go light. And if I'm like, if the design calls for 140, it's like I should probably have a third one there, because I've also found that, just rule of thumb, I have probably at the end of every irregular one, I probably got some pieces that I can't use. What I found is that stone suppliers are great when they bring it from the quarry, because they'll put the good ones on the outside, and on the inside they pack the junk that you're like, oh, are you kidding me? I just paid for it's basically buying chicken on the bone. You're like, I can't eat it, I can't do anything with it, I can make soup broth with it and stock, but I really can't do anything with these pieces in the middle except for use them as fill. And so sometimes it's a little bit nebulous. But if you have specific questions for those and you want a couple different parts, shoot me a note and I can make sure that you get a couple of those too. Yeah, happy to. Yep.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah. No, I think I have enough to absorb as well. It was a lot there. So thank you very
much.
much.
It was funny as I was putting the course together. I'm like, I wanted to start, I started broad and I was like, how are you all going to fit this into 4 sessions? And I just started to pair and try to make it more as focused as possible and as systematic as possible. But it was the same thing. I mean, it's just a lot of information to digest.
A lot of information.
Yeah.
But interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, I might have one more question.
Sure. Absolutely.
What would you say in terms of me like going out and shopping for things is the difference between bluestone and flagstone?
The name, pretty much. So what I typically call like bluestone, you'll find bluestone will come into bluestone and flagstone are interchangeably used out here. Where I was in the Midwest, when I was there, everybody called flagstone was from a company called Eden Flagstone, and it was a completely geologically different material. It was a limestone that was a much lighter color. And so here, bluestone or flagging are the same thing. So if you're looking for it, sometimes people, even in the same company, like it was weird for me. I'm gonna grab this real quick. When I came out here, right, this to me, when I started, this was trash paper, right? And then I had a Canadian professor, this goes back a minute, but he called it bumwad. And I'm like, what? And then I've heard people call it tracing paper, trash paper, flimsy, onion skin. And I was like, but it's the same thing. It just goes by so many names. And so it was really challenging to that part. But out here, are you Pennsylvania local? Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So if you're looking at those yards, if someone is to talk through it and you were look at it and you were saying, the best way that I can always say it is if you're asking for New York bluestone or Pennsylvania bluestone or bluestone, they'll point you in the right direction. Or if you're in the yard and you're walking around to it, you'll be able to see visibly, the pallets as you can walk through it. And you can identify it. And if you're ever in one of those situations, you can always say like, well, what do you call this here? Different places call it different things. But for the most part, I think on the East Coast, everybody knows it's bluestone. They call it the right thing. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you, after this session's being taped, right? So I'm gonna go, but if you still talk, it's all
Oh
taped,
yeah,
right?
no, I'm literally just
Okay.
hanging on here for a little bit of time, just in case anybody
Okay.
has questions. I basically
Okay.
figured I would hang here for 5 more minutes to it in
Okay.
case anybody had a question. But yeah,
I'm
I
with
set it up this way so that if anybody's done and they're like, listen, I gotta do X, Y, or Z, or like
Yeah.
run to wherever, everybody can do that, and then people that had questions can hang on if they want to. So
Okay, great. Well, thanks. It's nice to meet you, and I'll
absolutely,
see you next
yeah.
week.
All right, thanks,
Thanks so
Susan.
much.
Pleasure.
All right,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
All right, no more questions for me.
All right.
It's been
This way.
helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you.